Very good. So we are going to get started with Webinar Wednesday. I am your host, Rob Ellerman, CEO of Dispute Suite. Obviously, our mission is restoring financial dignity through administrative compliance. Advanced Credit Course, ACC 2026. Welcome to Webinar Wednesday. Look around you. We're living through a silent crisis. Millions of Americans, good, hardworking people, are being locked out of the economy. They're being denied homes, they're being denied cars, and denied jobs, not because they are necessarily high risk, but because some computer algorithm said no, right? And that's what we do as credit repair companies. We help these people out. We know that the game is rigged against them, the table is tilted, and we want to enter them into the conversation. We used to say that credit reporting is an A-B conversation, and they want the consumer to see their way out of it. What we're here to do is get those great consumers back into the conversation, so at least they have a fighting chance. We're here today because that system is broken, as we know. It operates on speed, and it operates on the incentives that benefit the credit reporting agencies and the data furnishers. It operates on speed and not necessarily truth. It prioritizes data sales over human rights and the rights of these consumers. And who's standing in the gap? You guys are. We're the ones who can help these consumers out. We're the ones who can help them get a fair shake. If you're on this webinar, you are not just a credit repair agent. You are a civil rights advocate, let's call it. You're the last line of defense for a protected class of citizens who have no voice in the boardroom. And we're going to put that voice there. Now, before we arm you for this fight, a required disclaimer, of course, because I'm going to be talking about dispute methodologies today quite a bit. I am not an attorney. I am a CEO, and I'm an auditor of this system, and I understand the way these systems work. I have a pretty good grasp of jurisprudence, philosophy, political science is my training, and we have at least enough knowledge to dispute these things correctly. And of course, we know how to add teeth to the equation and add turnings to the equation when we're ready to have them. Today, we're going to distinguish and dismantle sort of the not mine myth once and for all. If you've been a follower of ours for a while, you know that not mine has always been an issue and kind of a joke with us, because that's what the hack credit repair professionals are going to be doing. They're going to be out there saying, not mine, not mine, not mine, and all sorts of generic disputes. I've never really talked at length about why not mine doesn't work, except for situations where there's actually, say, a consumer who's gotten identity theft as a legitimate dispute. Obviously, you can use not mine disputes in those cases, but we're talking about more advanced credit repair. We're talking about more sophisticated credit repair, and we're going to learn how to audit the bureaus using the highest standards in the land. The reasonable investigation standard, which is really what opens the door for us to put the consumers in the conversation and get them in that boardroom that we were talking about, so that we can actually help to improve the consumer's credit profile more expeditiously than a lot of consumers imagine is possible. Because the reality is these organizations don't cross all their T's and dot all their I's. They do everything but. We're going to learn how to operate between the lines. Writing disputes so specific, they trigger federal investigation requirements, yet so disciplined that we never, give away the farm. A factual dispute methodology, oftentimes people get this idea that it has to be like hyper-specific about a date or about whatever, but really what it's about is it's making a specific request, and that specific request is what actually triggers legally a reasonable investigation requirement. So triggering those reasonable investigation requirements without going too far is really kind of what the nuance and the poetry of credit repair is, and that's something that I want to talk to you guys about today. So if you're ready to stop begging and start sort of enforcing consumers' rights, then we're going to get to work on that. Let's start with the philosophy. We have to invert your reality. You've been taught that the credit report is a source of truth, let's say. It's not. It's more akin to a digital echo. And those echoes are a distortion of the original sound. What I mean by that is that the credit reports are produced individually and iteratively via an instance of a query. Now, what I mean by that is, very similar to if you query an AI bot or if you query a search engine, the content that comes up is actually generative. It pulls from a variety of different sources and it produces a report. And that report is always in flux. It always varies. The information that they're using to substantiate and authenticate the identity of that consumer is often blended with other consumers with similar names, similar addresses, things of that nature. There is no strict authentication process that happens, or what I should say is it's not as strict as it ought to be with regard to how they're furnishing the information as a result of that query. That's why you see oftentimes fathers and sons with the same name having merged files, people on the same street having merged files. You see discrepancies and disparities between reports. My question is, if it's an actual report, if it's like a source of truth, then how is it that one report varies from another report, right? That triangulation that they do oftentimes with the three bureaus is something that actually helps us to understand the nature of what it is that they're doing. If it was written in stone or something like that, then they wouldn't need three reports. Or they would need, additional reports or additional data for, furnishing the qualifications for a home loan, let's say, for instance. So it's important to understand the law creates a sliding scale of responsibility. In Westra versus credit control, the courts ruled that if you are vague or say something like "not mine," the bureau is allowed to be lazy. Basically, the amount of effort and specificity that's put into the dispute is actually what controls for the reasonableness of the investigation that happens with the dispute. So that's something that's very important to understand. As we know, the FCRA requires that the disputes that happen be based upon the idea that the information is either false, inaccurate, or unfair, verifiable. The Bureau is allowed to be lazy, but in Cushman versus TransUnion, they ruled that if you are specific, the Bureau must do more than just parrot the data. And actually, parrot the data is written right in the decision. And that tells you a lot about how the courts look at information that is referenced via a reasonable investigation that's really just circular logic where they go back to the data furnisher to substantiate that what the data furnisher reported to them is what they reported to them. I know that sounds ridiculous, but that's actually what happens. So when we're thinking about how to execute on these, so let's call them vulnerabilities with the way the system works, you want to make sure that you make a specific allegation of unverifiability. You can make a specific allegation of inaccuracy, but what a lot of people don't understand is that's actually not a burden that the consumer is required to offer. If they have it, and that's great. If there are inaccuracies, that's great. If there's DOLA inaccuracies, or if there's data inaccuracies, or if there's disparities between the reports, all the more power to you. But really making a specific allegation of unfair viability, maybe, for instance, if the DOLA is inconsistent with the statute, you're going to want to make sure that you don't send information that isn't needed by them, or isn't required, or isn't. Sometimes what happens with consumers is, and credit repair companies make this mistake as well all the time, is they'll actually overshare information. The consumer is not required to provide, say, billing statements, for instance. The consumer is not required to, furnish every billing statement plus, their general ledger from their bank account, et cetera, et cetera. If they have it, that's great, but it's important to understand that it's not required. And this is something that sort of alienates consumers all the time from actually fighting for their own best interest, is because they think that the requirements are more substantial than they necessarily are. When in fact the burden of proof lies on the accuser. These negative items that are showing up on credit reports oftentimes are to be considered just mere allegations. Those allegations can be substantiated by demonstrated due diligence from the bureaus. And if they do a good job substantiating that information, then you, of course, have maybe something that can be considered factual. But until that due diligence happens, there's no reason to presume that any particular thing is needs to be there. So you want to make sure that you're using resources like the ACC specific allegations template so that you understand how this stuff works. You want to make sure that you understand case law like Cushman versus TransUnion. And you understand that there is a requirement that the credit reporting agencies do more than just parrot information. You want to make sure that you're working with a solution, a software solution or a technological solution that's pre-configured to deal with these sorts of things. The Cushman-style disputes are things that are proven to be very, very effective and proven to be very, very effective, particularly over the long game, which is what people want to see. Yep, I'll be switching the slide soon. We're still on slide number 1, so just for anyone who's concerned about that. Verification versus validation, the audit demand. A signature on a contract proves you open the account. It does not prove that you owe $5,420.18 today. That requires an audit. That requires a reasonable investigation. Don't ask for the contract. Don't ask for or furnish things that they should already have. Demand an audit of obligation. Verify that mutual consideration was exchanged and that this specific balance reflects strictly contractual charges. Demonstrate your due diligence from the furnisher that they know what they're talking about and that they did everything that they were supposed to do. Wait for them to say verified without producing a single ledger, without calling anybody, without doing any reasonable verification, and then the situation is moved back into the direction of the consumer because suddenly they haven't done the things that they need to do, that they're supposed to do, and that it's the consumer's right to expect. More often than not, you're going to see that these things are not done correctly. They're not done with any level of reasonableness, which is mandated by the law when you're making specific requests. The best evidence rule. The Bureau is relying on hearsay, digital code sent from a bank's computer. In any other court, this is inadmissible without the source material. When you're talking to the credit reporting agencies, it's okay to state that you're a data aggregator, not the custodian of records. What we mean by data aggregator, which is they're the echo, remember? That information is coming into them, but it's not their information. They don't have custody of that information. It's basically just a database which references another database, which references source materials and ledgers and accountancy, all of which oftentimes is not part of that consideration. You can demand that they provide primary source documents used to verify the information that's there. You can also conclude without the primary source your reporting is hearsay and legally insufficient. Does that mean that they're just going to give up when you do that? No, but you're laying the groundwork for, let's say, a conversation that's going to get quite specific and quite nuanced with regard to whether those derogatory items are actually being reported validly. You want to make sure that you understand federal rules of evidence and the way that that stuff functions in a potential court case and the way that these liabilities mount when these data furnishers and these credit reporting agencies don't do the things that they're supposed to do when protecting distressed consumers. The factual dispute mandate, why not mine, is a liability. Now, why do most people fail? A lot of times they fail in credit repair specifically because they're trying to help the investigation. They think if they explain the story, the Bureau will have mercy. The Bureau doesn't have mercy. The Bureau is a machine. It has no mercy. Mindless, heartless, soulless. It's got an automated configuration that responds the way that it does, and it's intended to benefit the credit reporting agency. It isn't intended to benefit the consumer. It benefits the consumer to the extent that it complies with the law. So obviously they're seeking to adhere to the law, and that's why these disputes oftentimes do work. But make no mistake, they don't have any incentive to do anything other than just meet the minimum requirements of their interpretation of the law, which is not the source of truth. Source of truth ultimately is a judge if these things were ever to go to court. So that's what we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about these things. If you send a not mine letter on an account you clearly paid, your own history contradicts you. That's why we can't do this for consumers, and that's why we shouldn't coach consumers to do this sort of thing. You basically just gave them permission to ignore you. You need to teach your clients that silence is their shield. You don't need to say, not mine, which oftentimes is inaccurate to even state and therefore illegal. You need to tell them some variation of basically Miranda rights, which is you have the right to remain silent here. You don't have to overshare. You don't have to put yourself at a disadvantage. You don't have to send checks. You don't have to send ledgers. You don't have to send sob stories and things of that nature. Oftentimes those things don't work. Sometimes they work with data furnishers. If you've been a good customer for a very long time, there's some semblance of relationship there, but it certainly doesn't work with the bureaus because the bureaus really aren't, there's people that run them, but the decisions are not being made by people. The decisions are being made by policy. So pivot to the data. This reporting is inaccurate and the obligation is unproven is the type of things that you should be thinking. The type of grammatical structures you should be etching into your minds. You need to make sure that you understand the consumer silence policy of the ACC. So when we're talking about this, it's not about, being cute or playing keep away with information or stuff like that. It's about just understanding what your rights are and that you don't have an obligation to furnish necessarily any information because the accusation is theirs. If they're making the accusation, then they ought to be able to substantiate that accusation. They ought to be able to demonstrate that those accusations are viable. If you cry identity theft on an account linked to your address, the system flags you as a fraudster, or worse, as a fraudster who's working with a credit repair hack. It'll freeze the file. What you need to establish is this actually ID theft? If it is, then you need to, of course, generally file a police report, furnish that police report to the credit reporting agencies, and usually it's something that gets taken care of very quickly, but oftentimes the consumers just don't know what the right order of operations is to get that done. Unless you're dealing with a case of just outright fraud, use data integrity as your defense. Dispute the dates, the balances, the status, of course. But don't let a sloppy dispute get your client locked out of their own credit. You don't want to start saying not mine when in fact it's demonstrable that it actually is theirs. And of course they know that it's theirs. They have contracts that the person has signed, et cetera, et cetera. Watch out for the goodwill bag. You don't need to start with the goodwill bag. A lot of people start with the goodwill bag. If you think you can get away with it with a data furnisher, depending upon the individual consumer's situation with that furnisher, then sometimes that can be a really good thing to do. But what I'd like you to keep in mind is that goodwill letters are often a confession of guilt, and they're a confession that the debts are substantiated. So if you're going to do that, make sure that you understand what you're doing and that you are communicating with the consumer that that is what they've done when they do that. You're admitting that the debt is accurate, and you're basically asking for a favor. One way to approach this is not to use goodwill templates. If the data is accurate, you can't dispute it. But is it? Is it 100% accurate? Find the error. Oftentimes there are errors that you wouldn't even imagine might be there that could help to substantiate the induction of a reasonable investigation. Compliance errors force deletion. Begging gets you nowhere. So make sure that if you're asking for good faith adjustments, that you've communicated with the consumer that that's what they're doing when they do that. They're actually admitting that this is theirs, and that's okay. If in a situation they're admitting, hey, this is mine, I got in a bad spot, I need to make some adjustments, maybe I can get some good faith adjustments to your reporting activity. There's nothing wrong with doing that per se. What's wrong with it is thinking that you're advantaging the consumer while you do it. In all cases, you're not advantaging the consumer when you do that. So you need to make sure that you understand when you're advantaging the consumer and when you're not. The era of not mine is over. Not mine is vague. Vagaries don't induce reasonable investigations. So it's not just not mine, it's all the different variations of not mine that exist out there as well. What you're going to do is you're going to trigger blocks, you're going to trigger flagging, you're going to trigger all sorts of things that are going to interrupt your credit repair process, and you're not going to get as good a results as you otherwise would have. Not mine is dead because it's vague, like I said. And we learned from Westra, vague gets you ignored. That's the case law, and that's what the case law supports. Professional standards versus spam. The bureaus use AI to sort mail. Not mine templates get sorted into the frivolous bucket. Factual audits get sorted into the investigation bucket. This is why we want to make sure we're doing factual audits and factual investigations based upon facts that we can identify that offer discrepancies, disparities, or a request for reasonable investigations. Adopt the tone of a forensic auditor, not a victim, in other words. Use this kind of language. I reviewed my file and found several errors in the calculation. This parsing bypasses the spam filter and forces a human to look at it. When you get a human to look at it, you increase the odds of getting that item deleted exponentially. The suspicious mail stall. They will send a suspicious mail stall letter to scare you. Don't worry, it's a bluff. They're trying to stop the 30-day clock, but whether they like it or not, the 30-day clock is on. Recognize that this is not a rejection. Recognize that this is a stall when it happens. You're going to reply that you're the consumer, I sent this, and you're to do your job. If you've set your contracts up correctly, you have a limited power of attorney for the purpose of helping them with these things, and they've approved all of these disputes in your process. So you are authorized to communicate through the consumer on behalf of the consumer to the credit reporting agencies. Make sure you understand that that 30-day timer has never stopped, and keep counting, because that 30-day timer is what you're going to use to come back around and say that you've gone beyond the 30-day requirement, and I expect a deletion. They label you frivolous to stop working. Specificity is the key that unlocks that door. The more stalling they do, the more specific we get, in other words. Specific factual disputes with specificity, as opposed to vagaries, are the idea that's going to allow for that reasonable investigation to take place. Remember, the law says that the more specific the request, the more specific and the more of a burden it puts on the reasonableness of the investigation. They don't spell out exactly what that means, but they do spell out the way that the courts think about the matter. They think that if you send a lazy dispute, that a lazy dispute deserves a lazy response. So don't do lazy disputes. Actually do the work. Actually understand what's going on. Actually understand the consumer's situation. That's not something that AI can necessarily do for you. You have to understand that if you're trying to comprehend the situation with the consumer, you really need to comprehend the situation with the consumer. You need to not send something that's lazy, overly templated, or overly sort of AI driven, right? Remember, there is a syntactic analyzer that's going on the Oscar system that's looking for grammatical patterns that are produced by AI. And of course, if you're using a technology that doesn't account for the syntactic patterns that the credit bureaus look for, then you're not going to have a good time, or you're not, at least not going to have as good a time as you otherwise could have. Read the rejection code. Include one new specific fact. The date closed contradicts the DOLA, for instance. Resubmit. I am providing new information. Under the FCRA, you must investigate. Make sure you understand what you're doing and why. Make sure you understand that even when they send you a stall letter, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not making progress and that you're not setting the table accordingly. The anatomy of a broken strategy. Current methodologies are failing on three distinct fronts. Continuing with the status quo invites legal risk and operational futility. Pain number one, liability. The risk of false affidavits and professional malpractice. We need to make sure that we're not disputing things that we know to be accurate or that the consumer knows to be accurate. That's why the way that we dispute things is very important. That's why when we know that things do belong to the consumer, for instance, that we're not saying they don't belong to the consumer. We're saying that the consumer's rights have to be protected, and in order to protect the consumer's rights, we can induce reasonable investigations into the accuracy of these derogatory items, into the accuracy of the items on the credit report that are causing the score to drop. Systemic ignorance due to lack of specific data inputs is what happens with rejection. And then you create that circular loop. That's where the pain happens in credit repair. The pain happens in credit repair when you create a verification of the verification. When the machines are verifying machines and they say, oh, reasonable investigation. Oh, I'm just checking the other database, the same database that I used to furnish the information. My verification is therefore reasonable, and I'm going to stall you out. What we need to do as credit repair professionals is understand how to break that circular logic and how to impose a more sophisticated strategy. The Cushman Court explicitly ruled that a reasonable investigation must consist of something more than merely parroting information. Wait for the generic verified response, in other words. Rebut it by with something like, you stated this was verified, yet you provided no proof. Cite, under Cushman versus TransUnion, parroting the furnisher's data is not a reasonable investigation, and they're required to perform a reasonable investigation that's congruent with the specificity of your arguments. The method of verification, MOV. Why this matters. You have the statutory right to ask how. If they can't tell you how they verified it, they didn't verify it. Who did you speak to? Is a great question. What is their phone number? Is also a great question. What documents did you review in this verification? It isn't enough just to say that it's verified. They have to demonstrate how it was verified, and they have to demonstrate who verified it. Otherwise, there's no reason to imagine that that investigation was indeed reasonable. The unverifiable argument. Silence equals unverifiable, and unverifiable equals deletion. Did they answer the specific question about the ledger? If the answer is no, then we simply assert failure to produce a ledger renders the balance unverifiable. Our demand then is delete per FCRA section 611. Very simple. We don't need to get into proving things on our side. What we need to get into is that they are required to verify reasonably any specific request for a derogatory item we consider to be unverifiable, inaccurate, or false. And it's important because people fixate on false and they fixate on inaccurate. But the law says that it also must be verifiable. So if you are to dispute based upon those grounds and request verifiability of certain aspects of the derogatory item, and they stay silent, that's grounds for deletion. The 30-day clock is ticking. The liability trap. Instructing clients to sign disputes that deny ownership of accounts they don't actually own is not just ineffective, it's dangerous. It's dangerous for them, and it's also dangerous for you. The mechanism of failure. Signing documents that are factually untrue creates massive professional liability for the CRO or any attorney who might be working with them, and it also can create liabilities for the consumer, which is really what we want to avoid. What we need to do is we need to shift from defense to offense. We need to stop asking and start warning. The courts have hinted that reporting accurate debt is a form of collections. Reporting inaccurate debt is harassment. When you warn them that your continued reporting of this unproven debt is a violation of the FDCPA, your liability forces, the liability you create forces actions faster than kindness. Because if that information is indeed unverifiable, and they continue to report that information, I'm speaking about the data furnishers that is, to the credit bureaus, it has been cleanly and plainly established that reporting information to the credit reporting agencies by the data furnishers is a form of debt collection practice. So it's important as credit restoration companies, as professionals, that we understand not only what the FCRA requirements are, but in conjunction with that, what the FDCPA requirements are. I know it sounds like a lot of alphabet soup, but it's really important to understand because not only do these organizations need to follow the consumer protection laws when it comes to credit reporting, but they also many times are actually using the credit reporting agency as a means by which to collect debts from the consumers. That's why these algorithmic rejections are becoming a big problem. The bureaus are increasingly ignoring disputes entirely. The systems require specific inputs to trigger an investigation. Without a specific factual basis, the algorithm categorizes the dispute as frivolous. You cannot argue with a computer using vague templates, especially as these computers get better and better. Legally, if it is not verifiable, it's false. There is no middle ground. So if an unverified debt or obligation is being reported to the credit reporting agency, it is an unfair debt collection practices violation in conjunction with an FCRA violation. When you state, I asked for proof and you provided none, you are letting them know that this is an unverifiable item. You can require them to delete this immediately per the FCRA guidelines and potentially FDCPA guidelines. When you combine this with letters of revocation, you're setting up what I call a revocation trap. You're severing the supply between the data furnisher and the credit reporting agency. The furnisher needs your permission to share your data. You gave it to them in the fine print when you set up whatever contract it is that you did as a consumer. But the consumers don't often understand that they can take that back. They can request that their information not be furnished to anyone, including the credit reporting agency. Right now, that one doesn't have a lot of teeth because that's oftentimes what we call a statutory requirement that they send that to the credit reporting agency. But what we know these data furnishers and debt collection companies like to do is they like to call people at work, they like to call family members, they like to harass the consumers by sending them texts and calling them over and over again at various times of the day, et cetera, et cetera. So letters of revocation are oftentimes a very important component of your strategy. And I highly recommend actually revoking the right to furnish information to the credit reporting agency at all if it can be something that might benefit the consumer. They're probably not going to do it, but it is something that gives you a pretense to walk back around and let them know that you required that revocation and they didn't comply with that revocation, which is inconsistent with fair debt collection practices. What you do is you send a revocation of authorization to the furnisher. You wait for it, and then after the revocation is in place, you start to dispute to the furnisher on those grounds. Sounds complicated? It's actually very, very easy. So what exactly do we dispute? We look for glitches in the matrix. If the account type is wrong, the balance is suspect. One error poisons the whole fruit. What you need to do is identify where these things exist. For instance, if you find a factoring company listed as open, that is misclassified. Since the classification is false, the entire entry is unreliable, and you can demand deletion. You can demand an update if that's your goal, or you can demand deletion. Remember, justifications for deletions are also inaccuracies. We aren't always just fixing the inaccuracy. The consumer isn't required to fix every inaccuracy. The consumer has a right to having accurate information being reported on their credit report. And it's perfectly reasonable to request a deletion based upon those inaccuracies. This is how you break that circular logic of the verification. The systemic failure where legitimate errors are never deleted because the verification process is automated and not human. Remember, it's between the lines where the credit repair company lives. The credit repair company lives in the place where reasonable investigations are induced and those investigations are scrutinized. That's where you're going to churn your butter in most cases. You can find discrepancies between credit reports. You can find inaccuracies related to dates of last activity. You can find inaccuracies with regard to payments and obligations and things of that nature. All of those things are things that we know we need to do. But what I want to focus on are the things that people don't necessarily know can be done, or strategies that people don't necessarily think of when they're confronted with a consumer who's saying, look, I just don't know what to do. I really don't know what's going on. And I think that we need to approach this from the perspective of, hey, maybe they should verify what's going on here. Maybe you have no idea why a $100 cable bill turned into a $5,000 obligation. Maybe you have no idea how that gym membership, continued to go on and on and on and on and on, right? Even after the cancellation occurred. These are all things that are relevant to whether that information is being presented to the credit reporting agency factually. Remember, these companies have every incentive to expand the consumer's obligations beyond what they're actually obligated to pay, and every incentive to utilize those expansions as a means by which to negotiate with the consumer, because they know that they're probably headed for settlement. They know that the settlement is probably going to be some fraction of what the actual amount owed is. And so imagine that they have every incentive to make that amount owed as high as possible, because they know that there's going to be some settlement involved in the process. The organizations that I've seen that are most guilty of this are medical. Medical organizations love to overcharge consumers, oftentimes with price points and things like that they didn't specifically agree to. They just say, you owe this. Why? Because that's the price. And that's the price not only for everybody, right? If you've ever seen the prices that actually get paid by the insurance companies, and then you see the prices that they charge walk-ins, you'll understand that there's different price points for everybody. And there's different price points for everybody, and oftentimes those are price points that were not agreed to. And so it's reasonable to request how it is that this contract between this person and that organization was substantiated. How did it get to this place? Explain the logic. We need to understand what your argument actually is in order to understand what this allegation actually means. I saw a report that we're still seeing the cover slide. If that's the case, no worries. I'll share all of the slides with you that I'm rolling through here. And no problem. My understanding is that I'm actually going to answer a question, because I don't normally do this. Normally I just roll. My understanding is that if you lead your disputes with your POA, that you may be tipping your hand. If you have the POA, you hold onto it in the event you needed to furnish it in an escalation or litigation situation. Yeah, I'm not saying you actually furnish the POA. It's just that you have it. So because you have it, you don't have to be concerned about the way that you're representing yourself. You don't have to put, a letterhead on the top of the document or whatever. So the factual dispute pivot. Factual disputes are the only legal leverage left, moving away from template-based denials and toward specific data-backed challenges provide the basis required to pierce that algorithmic shield and also induce the reasonable investigations that we're looking for. There are other things that show up. Here's an interesting one, guys. Reporting zero high credit creates a false utilization spike. These are math errors. These are things that you can find. Oftentimes you'll see that there's a balance of zero, right? And then you'll see that there's some type of utilization rate being expressed. Well, if there's a balance of zero, then you can't divide by zero, as we know. If they continue to do that stuff, they're going to create some kind of a black hole in the universe, and there's no way that they can actually substantiate that. Watch out for the re-aging trap, or updating date open to make old debt look new. This is an illegal re-aging practice. It's something that the credit reporting agencies act as a facilitator from the data furnishers to actually re-age these things so that they actually impact the consumer in negative ways that they don't deserve. This will often happen when a data furnisher actually sells that debt to a debt collection company. The debt collection company will then try to re-age the debt oftentimes, and that's something that they can't do. So what you have to do is highlight that re-aging is a deceptive practice and request the deletion. You'll see the same thing with bankruptcy cleanups. Reporting a balance on discharged debt is a legal collection activity. It ignores the federal court's designation on these things. There's a discharge order. Remove the sensitive info, leaving the order visible. Reporting a balance is a legal collection activity. Just delete. What you'll see is you'll see a bankruptcy on a consumer's credit report, and then you'll see that there's actually amounts that are being shown on that credit report when they should be reporting zeros. If a consumer has gone through bankruptcy, then that means they have no more debt obligations. If they have no more debt obligations, then that means that they can't show up on the credit report. If the data furnisher continues to report that those debts are owed, then you have a problem. What you have is a unfair debt collection practices procedure that's being foisted upon the consumer in such a way as to try to get them to accidentally continue to pay on those things. Inquiry challenges. Inquiry challenges rely on permissible purpose. If there's no purpose and there's no permissible purpose that's been granted, then there can be no inquiry. Now, oftentimes inquiries are kind of a matter of record, right? It's difficult for a consumer to say after they get an auto loan, right, that they signed for, that they didn't facilitate an inquiry. But what oftentimes happens is the consumer may not have facilitated 35 inquiries all over the damn place. What we see there, or a situation where they continue to shop that consumer's profile after the fact. Those are beyond what we consider to be permissible purpose, and those you definitely have the right to dispute. You also have the right to require that they demonstrate that they received permissible purpose. You don't necessarily have to dispute whether permissible purpose was granted. You just want to see that permissible purpose was granted, and maybe that it was granted for all of these different banks. If you've been involved in credit repair for any amount of time, you'll understand very well that oftentimes consumers are given the net impression that they provided permissible purpose for one lender, and in fact, they got hit with 35 different lenders. Now, of course, we know that inquiries only last for a couple of years, and we know that they only have a marginal impact on the credit report. But there might be situations where those additional inquiries are actually causing a problem where that consumer might be just outside the scope of getting the next loan, within that 10% margin or whatever the inquiry amount accounts for. I think it was 10% last time I checked. You're going to want to make sure that they demonstrate, right, that they've done a reasonable investigation into the situation. So one way to approach that in that situation with the consumer is the consumer states that they did provide permission for inquiries, but they didn't provide permission for that many inquiries. Please demonstrate that they did. Show us the paperwork. Show us the receipts. Tell us who you called in order to determine these facts. Tell us where you got this information from, and let's orient around a new source of truth, because your circular logic, where you're just verifying the data that was originally sent to you, isn't substantial enough if we start to get factual. Let's talk about the Lover Protocol. The Lover Protocol is what we call the letter of verification. We must establish the failure to demonstrate the proof. An L&V letter, right, is a demand for the audit of obligation, and you do it via trackable mail. we can talk to you about how to write a great letter of revocation, a letter of verification, and how to use those tools to help you with both the credit reporting agency and the data furnisher. Remember, if they don't answer, they are barred from future collection activities. When you send these things out to the data furnishers and you send these things out to the credit reporting agencies, sometimes you'll be like, oh man, they're not responding, they're not updating, they're not doing any of these things. But actually, if you're a seasoned credit repair professional, you understand that in some ways that's good for the consumers because they have an obligation to respond to these things, right? It's called estoppel by silence, which means that you've created a burden for them to demonstrate that they are engaged in the conversation that the consumer has a right to be a part of. If they disengage from that conversation, all of a sudden you've made the situation for your consumer a lot better. The reason you've made the situation for the consumer a lot better is because, like we discussed, they do have an obligation for reasonable investigations, and they have an obligation to respond in the right way to letters of revocation and letters of verification. If you revoke the data furnisher's ability to communicate with the consumer or to communicate with the parents of the consumer or to communicate with the workplace of the consumer, or dare I say, even communicate with the bureaus themselves, they should actually be responsive to that, and they should be responsive in a way that actually supports the rights of the consumers as prescribed by law. Remember, the consumer has the right to stop the noise. They have the right to say, I revoke consent to contact me at this number. I revoke consent to share my public information, my non-public information, I should say. Any future call or reporting is going to be a violation. Make sure you understand that you're laying the groundwork for that and that the consumer has a right not to be harassed by these people. Making sure we're using OCR-ready formatting is really critical because the OCR is going to look for these sorts of things, the not mine traps. We want the scanner to read dispute. We don't want the scanner to read junk. We don't want the scanner to kick it out. Even though if they do kick it out and it's reasonable, that actually creates additional liabilities for them. But we want to make progress. We want to actually get to the deletion. The not mine trap is a generic denial of ownership. It can be factually untrue, and it can be demonstrated to be factually untrue, and it's a professional liability. It's also a red flag for fraud algorithms and the new AI configurations that are running these e-Oscar scans. Factual dispute are specific factual inaccuracies. They are legal sound and they create zero liability. They force investigation beyond the circular logic of the reinvestigation spiral that they like to do. We need to make sure that we're using simple fonts in these situations, Courier or Arial. We don't want any graphics or logos or, hey, I'm this big wig credit repair person or blah, 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 blah. That stuff doesn't work. And in fact, you're likely to get bounced out if you do those sorts of things. You want to make sure that you have certain keywords in there. You want keywords like dispute. You want keywords like SSN. You want to make sure that the authentication of the consumer is happening and that they can see that it's happening. If you don't say SSN and you just provide a number, it may not actually grab that number as the SSN. So we need to make sure that when we're putting those things out there, that we're actually using the keywords that we know the e-Oscar system latches onto in order to move the dispute forward. We need to make sure we're using variable syntax. We need to look like humans, not robots. Change I dispute to please verify such and such because I dispute. We need to make sure that we can spin the paragraph orders. I just got a question. What if the bureaus are not sending results back to the client? Well, they're required to send results back to the client, so we should ask them to furnish the evidence that they sent it. In addition to that, they're more than just a response. They're required to update the report. They are definitely getting lazy, Christina. I agree. So, varying the syntax and having a technological solution that knows how to vary the syntax per EOSCR standards is something that we're going to start to get. Yes, method of verification. That's correct. You need to make sure that you've got a technological solution that accounts for that. If the consumer sounds like a Harvard attorney with their first letter, that's something that's going to be a flag. We have to make sure that it's in everyday language, and we have to make sure that the patterns that are being used for the grammatical construction, which is the way that these large language models work, are not something that can be pinpointed right on the dot as, hey, this is an LLM. If they can do that, then they're going to have grounds for just kicking it out. Should they be allowed to do that? Probably not, but that's what they're doing. And we have good evidence that that's what they're doing. So when we're working with this stuff, we need to make sure that we have an auditor's mindset. We need to make sure that we understand that we are auditing for the compliance of the data furnishers and the credit reporting agencies. We are searching for factual disputes, yes. We are helping consumers who are legitimate victims of identity theft. Of course, we're going to help those people, and of course, we're going to use the tactics that are best for helping those people. But what we want to do is we want to make sure that the consumers who's just looking at their credit report, and they're just, everyone's experienced this. Consumers looking at their credit report, and they're just like, I don't understand where all of this stuff came from. I don't understand where this number comes from. It used to be this number, and now it's this number, and I just don't understand. Right? Was there a hidden fee structure that was involved? Are there fees that were added that were unnecessary? Were services rendered to the consumer? These are things that I see happen all the time. What happens all the time is, say someone has an internet bill or something of that nature, and the internet never worked. Maybe they signed the contract, maybe they installed the box, right? But the system never actually worked. Well, does that consumer have an obligation to pay? Well, I don't think so. Of course they don't. So you need to make sure that when we're doing these reasonable verifications and investigations, that the investigations that come back are actually reasonable based upon what the consumer is telling you. When we do this, we eliminate the liability of creating false affidavits, not only for ourselves, but for the consumers themselves. And of course, like we said before, we're bypassing the circular logic of automated verification. You need to leverage the power of specific factual basis for your disputes. And if you understand the types of disputes that you can do, then you understand how to avoid making what can be considered to be false disputes or disputes that are, quote, illegal, right? It is the only way to protect your license and to serve your clients. Now, when I say license, I'm talking to, say, an attorney, right? If you're a credit repair company, you're probably licensed and bonded by a state, perhaps, but it is a great way to make sure that you are on the up and up with, state AGs, with any type of Better Business Bureau reporting agencies, et cetera, et cetera. Anyone who might have an issue with you, you want to make sure that you're not putting the consumer in a bad spot where they might be, subject to additional liabilities that they didn't even have when they started to work with you. So that's the way we have to approach this stuff so that we can be considered a professional outfit. So let's be real for a minute. The system isn't designed for your client to succeed. It is designed to extract maximum value from their mistakes. But we have the tools to change that trajectory. We have case law, right? We have the statutes, and we have the technology through products like Dispute Suite. We have training tools like the ACC, right? If you haven't gotten the ACC yet, do order it. We're working with our publisher right now, and the books that have been ordered so far are going out soon so that everyone can read together. You're going to get not only all the classic ACC modules, but you're going to get the updated 2026 modules with that. We have continued our promotion from Christmas, and you should continue to try to take advantage of that so long as we have that running. We're going to continue to do these sorts of educational tutorials where you can reference the educational material and you can read along, right? We want this education, especially when we launch the ACA, which is going to be our Advanced Credit Academy, to be multimodal and multimedia. We want you to have the book, right? Because that's the way you learn. You have a book, you listen to it, you watch it, right? And then maybe we can start to do some testing and some back and forth and things like that. And that's how you guys are going to become the best professionals in the marketplace. And that's how we're going to accomplish our goal of making Dispute Suite the home for the best credit repair companies in the industry, not the get-rich-quick companies, not the people who think that you can become a credit repair professional in 2 weeks. The home for really great credit repair professionals who really know what they're doing and are super aligned with their consumers, who, yes, make money and are successful, but are actually successful as a consequence of their alignment with the consumers and exacting their mission to help the consumers as a protected class from predatory lenders, from a system that's rigged against them, from all of these negative incentives that these organizations have to actually give the consumers a bad shake. That's what we're all about here. I hope that you guys find these things educational. I'm really happy that we've got people asking questions now. Our groups keep getting bigger and bigger, so that's a really exciting sign. And we're going to continue to do these things and continue to talk to people in the industry and continue to create a rallying call for the organizations who want to come in and want to be part of something that's maybe a little bit different than the things that are out there. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and we will see you next week for Webinar Wednesday.